Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is forest connections, how trees and we are bonded. And it's going to be presented by our wonderful expedition leader, Eddy Savage. Eddy, thank you so much for being here today. I'm going to turn it right over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Sunny. It's absolutely fantastic to be back presenting a webinar for Natural Habitat Adventures. And on a really favorite topic of mine, I spend a lot of time in the woods, a lot of time in the forest. So I'm excited to kind of get started on that. For those of you who, oh, hold on, always with presentation glitches. There we go. There we go. That's me coming up here in a sec. Standing on a sailboat somewhere in the Great Bear Rainforest, looking absolutely drenched and quite frankly in my happy place. I really quite like the rain. Works for someone who works in a rainforest. But just an introduction of me to you. My name's Eddy Savage. I live in Victoria, British Columbia. Right now I'm out in Sydney, British Columbia, or Sydney on Vancouver Island in British Columbia. I've been working with Nat Hab since 2016. I started out working with them on their polar bear expeditions up in Churchill, Manitoba. And since then, I've done their Northern Lights trips in Churchill, their Churchill summer trips with beluga whales, Switzerland, as well as their wild side of China trips. And my background kind of beyond that is I've been working as a guide in some form for about 14 years. Working with grizzly bears in BC, whale watching, kayak guiding in Antarctica, and all sorts of different stuff in between. So basically, if there's kind of in a nutshell, one way to describe what I do when I'm not working and what I do when I'm working is basically spend time in nature. It's where I am happiest. And so let's kind of get into forest connections. So since I returned, I was just up in polar bear country in Churchill for the last 5 weeks. Sorry, excuse me, my chair's just fumbling here. I was just up in Churchill, Manitoba for the last 5 weeks up until about November 12th. Not too long ago, about a week and a half ago, Nat Hab just finished up the 2021 polar bear season. And with that, I want to say hello to anybody who I may have met on any of my expeditions along the way. Nice to see you again. Well, I can't see you, but you can see me. So nice for you to see me again. Nice to know that you're watching. But since I returned from polar bear season, one of the things that I miss most sometimes when I'm up in Churchill per se is the big lush rainforest of the coast. And so I've been basically trying to get back to my roots. I actually haven't really spent much time back in Victoria or on Vancouver Island since about August of 2020. I realized over the fall that I had spent one night in my condo in Victoria since July. And so now that I'm back, I'm trying to like purposefully position myself in one spot and immerse myself being home, because it's so important to connect with where you're from, I find. And I felt like I was losing that a bit. So I've been basically getting out, going for walks. It's kind of one of those things where it's just like, I'm bored today. What do? I'll go for a walk for a few hours. And so I just end up in a forest somewhere, wandering around, and I'm observing and listening and watching and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, it's where I'm kind of happiest, spending time among trees, creeks, shrubs, and the animals and all that kind of stuff. And while I was out there, I started thinking, I'm just like, wow, I sure feel connected. I sure feel like intertwined within this forest. And I'm like I'm just like looking at the trees and looking at how trees grow and how plants grow around each other and the soil composition and all this kind of stuff. And I'm just like, there's a lot of really fascinating stuff that goes on in this forest underneath that connects this whole forest to itself and makes it a forest basically. But I'm also feeling super connected to it. So I kind of want to share that with people. And I was like, I've got some presentations coming up. Maybe I'll try to talk about that. So it got me thinking, how can I describe this to you? How connected is this forest? How can I begin to describe what's going on? And so this presentation is in two parts. The first part, we're going to talk about one of my favorite forest connections. And I want to like kind of preload this with, there is no one way, or like there's no one presentation that can fully encompass how connected forests are, how interconnected ecosystems are, and how they work around each other. This is just one kind of cool part of it that I'm going to describe for you today, and that is the mycorrhizal network, or mycorrhizal fungi. Fascinating stuff that we'll get into in just a sec. And then towards the end of it is the other side of the connection for me, which is actually getting to spend time in nature and connecting with nature in a meaningful way, more so than just going for a walk and taking pictures of stuff, or walking with friends and that kind of stuff. It's a little bit deeper than that, and a little bit more rewarding than that, I find. So let's get started. Oh, and first things first, one of the this topic, sometimes I talk about it on trips, but I'd say that I've become more and more interested with these two topics kind of in the last few months, maybe the last couple of years, and so it hasn't quite made it to like the forefront of my discussion topics when I'm on expedition, but it's going to start being a dominant topic while we're out there. And one of the things that I find really wonderful actually about working with Nat Hab and connecting with you folks is basically like, you are nature people, and you're traveling with Natural Habitat Adventures. You're coming on these trips to these wild spaces, and you're fully immersing yourselves in these areas. And so kind of like having this depth of knowledge, or having the ability to forest bathe, which we'll talk about at the end, is something I feel that a lot of travelers who I've met through Natural Habitat Adventures could really pick up on. It's just, nature is such an important space for us to all explore, learn about, photograph, be a part of. And so I'm really excited to share this with people who share kind of the same passion and willingness to learn about the outdoors. Okay, so let's talk about the science of tree communication. So all trees around the world, well, about 80% of plants on Earth create some form of symbiotic relationship with fungi, which is pretty incredible. And a focus of some of the discussions we're going to do, or we're going to focus on some research done by Dr. Suzanne Simard of the University of British Columbia, a longtime British Columbia resident, has lived here her whole life. At first, some of the stuff we're going to talk about was, maybe perceived as a bit of a far-fetched idea, but as more research has been done over the last few years, it's basically revealed this incredibly complex and marvelous network that it makes a great deal of sense, and is really incredible to talk about. So from a very general kind of description, basically trees and forests and plants can't rely solely on their root systems alone to derive all of the essential nutrients and water, in some cases, from their soil, from the soil around them. Because of the shortfall, they essentially rely on an underground network in the form of this symbiotic relationship between plants and fungi that can fill some of those gaps in their nutrient needs or their water needs and that kind of stuff. And we'll kind of get into that right now. So some of the key players that we'll talk about are going to be our mycorrhizal fungi, or the mycorrhizae. Mycorrhizae essentially means fungus root. And so in the picture here, you can probably recognize the reproductive organs of the mycorrhizae, which would be mushrooms, lots and lots of mushrooms everywhere we go. But those are essentially the reproductive organs of the fungi, and the roots are all below the Earth's surface, kind of in this big network. What the mycorrhiza does is essentially covers and accesses most areas of the soil. It is incredibly well intertwined into the soil, so much so that if you just put your foot down on a nice patch of the forest, underneath that foot, in a microscopic network of this mycorrhiza, you could have hundreds of kilometers of microscopic network and what are called hyphae or hair-like kind of extensions of the fungi that go everywhere. And it's just such a minute and such a small kind of thing to try to visualize. It's quite difficult. But essentially, what this mycorrhizal fungi does, or this big network does underneath the forest, is it increases the ability for trees and plants to harbor nutrients, including getting better access and uptake to important minerals or essential elements like phosphorus and nitrogen that are vital to the tree's overall health. Another thing that this mycorrhizal fungi can do is basically increase the tree's ability to access water and access nutrients in poor soil conditions, areas where there's maybe too much drainage or there's a short supply of water. The fungi can help deliver this to the trees. In exchange, that it's not one-sided by any means. It's an exchange. The fungi is not just doing this out of the kindness of their heart, giving the trees all of these nutrients. It's two-sided, and that's what makes it symbiotic. So we'll get into that here, which is the other key player with this, which is plants, trees. Essentially, what they can do that the fungi can't is the trees have access to the energy of the sun, and so the trees photosynthesize. The trees create the sugars or the carbohydrates or the carbon, and they're able to send that carbon down into the mycorrhizal network and trade it for the nutrients that it needs for its metabolism, like the phosphorus and the nitrogen. It's a pretty good deal. Another benefit, of course, is in areas where you have plant, like this plant growth or the tree growth and then undergrowth, it protects the soil. And if you have an area that's been logged where you take all the trees out and you have just an exposed mountainside, the mycorrhizal network doesn't just survive on its own because it's a symbiotic relationship. It's lost the ability then to get all of that carbon or all those carbohydrates from the trees. So in order to have kind of the balance and the healthy forest system and this mycorrhizal network functioning to its maximum capacity, you need to have kind of a good forest cover, good plant cover. Depending on the environment, of course, it will vary because you can also get this mycorrhizal network up in the Arctic tundra. But you need to have kind of these plants that will protect the mycorrhizal network as well. So, as I was saying, these networks, I hope everyone's starting to get a bit of a picture of this kind of like underworld web. They can be found in most ecosystems. Like I said before, approximately 80% of plant species globally are connected by some type of mycorrhizal fungi. The benefits, we'll get to that, but you can find it pretty much everywhere. Arctic tundra, tropical rainforest, desert ecosystems, the rainforests here in British Columbia, everything in between. Fungi plays, the mycorrhizal fungi plays a key part in their success and ability to grow and overcome. So let's take a little bit of a closer look here. Like I was saying, there's a symbiotic relationship. The fungi connects into the roots of the plants and the trees, and it can actually, it basically kind of wraps around the tip of the root on a microscopic scale and partially protects it and partially allows for kind of this nutrient exchange. So it's two-phased. It's not just the nutrient exchange, it's also able to protect the tips of the tree root from parasites and from decay and that kind of stuff, which is pretty interesting. So there's what we would call a constant dialogue and exchange. There's always an exchange going on. Probably sometimes more nutrients will be given to the tree, and later more carbon will be given from the tree to the fungi. But it's a constant connection. Now, trees can be connected to each other through this. So one fungi doesn't necessarily just connect to one tree. One fungi can connect to potentially hundreds, or one mycorrhiza can connect to potentially hundreds of trees or hundreds of plants within an area. And some mycorrhiza can connect to different species of trees as well. And they're not just kind of focusing on, say, like Douglas firs, or focusing in, say, just specifically on alder trees or something like that. They can actually, some fungi or some mycorrhizae are able to interconnect different species of trees. So there's a really cool phrase that was dubbed called the wood wide web. You know, it is kind of like the internet of the underground with all these multiple connections and everything, and all these different connections that are exchanging information, nutrients, chemicals, all kinds of stuff underground. It's pretty spectacular. So, like I was saying, this might be a double slide here, but maybe just some other ways to kind of envision that would be, you know, it's this underground pipeline. Something I was trying to describe it to my mom, actually. I'm like, maybe we can like think about it as the mycorrhiza network being like the, you know, how you've got just the underground water pipes that are coming from the main source, the underground water pipes in your city, and they all connect up to your houses, but that doesn't facilitate the two-way exchange. But anyway, maybe like telephone lines would be better, or the internet. But basically, they're all it's kind of this resource exchange that's facilitated through this network. And I think this is a double slide, so I'm stumbling. So I'm going to go to the next one. So let's talk about some of the studies as to kind of how we figured out, or how it was discovered. I hope you like my artwork. I tried to do a little drawing there with mushrooms, and all of the blue lines there kind of are meant to be kind of this intertwined network of mycorrhiza. So there was a study done. This is one of the initial studies that was done by Dr. Suzanne Simard, and the way that she describes it, or that she has described it in some webinars that I've watched on the topic, and things that I've read on the topic, is that it was done very much on a budget. But what they did is they took 80 tree saplings, and they paired them off into groups of 2, and they connected them. They were then connected via a mycorrhizal network, making sure they were connected via the mycorrhiza fungi, mycorrhizal fungi. And one tree would have been covered with some kind of protective layer. It was like a plastic bag, and the other tree was also covered. So there was no possible way that there could be cross-contamination. And they used 2 different carbon isotopes. One of them was radioactive, one of them was not. But the main point is that these compounds were easily identifiable in a lab setting, and they're distinct. So they would be able to tell the difference between the 2. And tree number 1, they gave the radioactive sample. Tree number 2, they gave the non-radioactive sample. And they left them for a period of time. They came back, and when they analyzed the 2 trees, they found that they had both with them. So they basically had traded, in a sense, some of the radioactive misting. Sorry, the misting, when they misted the trees with the radioactive and the non-radioactive, it was basically taken up by the trees through photosynthesis, and then it would be in the tree. And then the tree would then pass it through the mycorrhizal network over to the other tree. And so it basically proved that there was a kind of this 2-way communication between trees that were connected by this network. It wasn't just kind of the fungi delivering nutrients and information to one tree, and then that one tree giving it back to the mycorrhiza. It was actually the mycorrhiza had become kind of that network in between the 2 trees. It had become this pipeline in between the 2 that was passing information back and forth. It's a 2-way street, which is pretty darn exciting to me. So sample 1, radioactive. Sample 2, non-radioactive, and they did end up trading. So there's another one, another study done on Douglas fir and paper birch. So this is one of those examples where you have a deciduous tree and a coniferous tree. They're not related trees, but they are connected via the mycorrhizal network. And so what was really cool is the coniferous tree, like in one example here, so the coniferous tree would be producing more energy in the wintertime and the fall because they don't lose their leaves and they still are able to photosynthesize to an extent during the fall and winter. Whereas in this example, it was paper birch. The paper birch loses all its leaves in the fall and it's no longer photosynthesizing, and it's gone into a state of dormancy through the winter. And so what they found is that the flow of carbon and nutrients basically went to the tree that had it worse off. So the coniferous tree had been basically, is fine, it's got leaves, it's able to create a little bit of energy, but it's got more energy and maybe not necessarily excess energy, but it had more energy and enough energy that it would basically be able to send that carbon and those nutrients over to the tree that was not producing any energy at all. And so it's kind of like this equilibrium. Now I want to show you the next slide here, which is a little bit of a switch, which is the coniferous tree in the summertime. It keeps the same number of leaves and it's photosynthesizing, absolutely. But the paper birch kind of has this explosion of growth, and it has basically the big wide leaves that are photosynthesizing to a massive extent. And that tree is then creating way more energy, way more carbohydrates are being created through the photosynthesis process. And they're able to send, in that case, the flow of carbon goes to the sink, which would be the coniferous tree, because it's not producing as much, but the paper birch was producing way more. And so they found like the balance kind of would be in the summertime, that deciduous tree, the paper birch, is sending more nutrients to the coniferous tree because it's producing less. And just like the previous slide said, the coniferous tree in the fall and the winter would send more nutrients to the paper birch because it's producing more during that time of year. And so that exchange, it's kind of like this equilibrium or this balance. And I think something really interesting is maybe wondering what processes are facilitating that. And, is it a process of the fungi kind of saying, we need to make sure the whole forest is balanced here? Or is it a process of the trees, the tree having excess and sending it, or is it the paper birch, trying to pull some from the network? But either way, it's very interesting to think that there's kind of like this nutrient or this energy exchange going on that is completely facilitated through this network of mycorrhizal fungi. That's super fascinating. So now with that, there's also the topic of mother trees and hub trees. So this one I find really fascinating as well, especially living in British Columbia, where I don't know if anyone's seen the news right now. We're kind of looking at, we've got less than 3% of our original old growth forest left. And these big old trees in particular through this research are being found to be extremely important to environments and extremely important to the regeneration of forest ecosystems. They basically carry they're massive energy producers, massive suppliers to the forest around them. And so when you knock down a whole stand of old growth forest, you lose the hundreds and hundreds of years of growth, development, and energy and nutrients that would have been found there very quickly. So anyway, a researcher created a map of a mycorrhizal network within one forest area. They're using DNA sequencing within the mycorrhiza to basically follow where nutrients or basically where the nutrient flow is going, and which trees were connected to which trees. And they found that the biggest and oldest trees in the study area were the most linked, highly linked, sometimes having hundreds of connections to other trees, which is mind-boggling to think that one big old tree could be connected via this network to hundreds of other trees. The big old trees, they've got bigger root systems and they can associate with these bigger mycorrhizal networks. They've also got kind of the best spot in the forest, being so tall and big, they've kind of established themselves, and they have such widespreading root systems alone, also connected to much larger mycorrhizal networks, that they basically get more of everything. And so they are this hub or this source, this resource for lots of other trees that are kind of potentially in a disadvantaged state in the forest. Like something maybe to think about would be like a sapling that's sitting in the shade of a big old tree. How is a sapling going to kind of fight its way past this 800-year-old 65-meter or 250-foot tall tree to get to that sunlight. And so it's not just coming from whatever, where the sun's shining on the forest floor. That little sapling is going to be involved in this mycorrhizal network, and is going to be kind of in that sink category where it might be getting more nutrients or more carbon from these big tall mother trees or hub trees. So extra carbon provided by these hub trees in a study was found to increase seedling survival by 4 times. So if a seedling was connected to a mycorrhizal network where there was a mother tree or a hub tree, it was 4 times more likely to survive, which is pretty extraordinary. And there is also evidence, which I find really interesting, that there's an ability for trees' root systems to recognize their seedlings and create more space for them within their root network and favor in some form the distribution of carbon to these seedlings. So they could be facilitating their own seedlings in some way, which is also something I find really, really fascinating. And with that, I kind of touched on this a bit. Understanding these hub trees, it's incredibly important for us when we look at how we're going to conserve the last of our old growth forests, or even forest management in general. Because if you have these trees that are basically known to be facilitating the growth of other trees, like you'd want to leave them in place, or it would be ideal to leave them in place so that they can facilitate the next generation. We're always going to have a demand for wood fiber and harvesting of trees in some way. And so by having these larger trees kind of left within environments, maybe it's a better way forward for some of our logging practices, but that's a whole nother discussion altogether. So here's just a little graphic to kind of give you an idea. So the mother tree or the hub tree is better connected, collecting more energy from photosynthesis. It has better access to water and phosphorus and nitrogen via its hundreds of connections and vast connection to the mycorrhizal network. And then these smaller trees or saplings that are maybe growing in the shade or in a less opportune place. Maybe the soil's a little more rocky. Maybe they're slightly hidden from the sun by the trunk of a bigger tree, or maybe like some cave structure or something like that. They can be connected to the mycorrhizal network and still grow because of that flow of carbon and nutrients to those trees from these bigger trees via the mycorrhizal network. Super, super cool. Okay, and then with that, trees talk. Injured or dying trees can send signals to other trees connected within the mycorrhizal network, and this can increase the resistance, their resistance to future stresses, whether that be kind of on a short term or a longer term. Defense signals would be transferred from one tree, like if one tree was being attacked by pine beetles or something like that, it could potentially send that alarm system down through the mycorrhizal network and connect up with other trees nearby. So maybe those trees have a bit of a head start when trying to build an immunity to a certain threat. There was a study done where they had several different plants that were connected all through a mycorrhizal network, and one of the plants was separated. It was still connected underground by the network, but it was separated and it was given aphids. So the aphids then were eating the shrub and attacking the shrub. And what they found is that the other plants that were connected, it took a little bit of time, but the other plants that were connected, I can't remember this species of plant off the top of my head, but what happened was they basically sent out their defense mechanism, like in response to this one plant that is not them, but is connected to them via this underground network. They began to give off their stress signal, which was actually was basically something that invited wasps to come, and the wasps would then eat the aphids or kill the aphids and protect them. So it was like there's this alarm bell going off kind of to a distant plant, but because of this incredible network, the other plants are able to create a defense system from that, which is it's kind of mind-boggling once you try to wrap your head around that kind of thing. As far as forest ecology goes, it's really fascinating. So that's kind of the end of my kind of scientific or kind of the discussion of the mycorrhizal network side of things. It's something that I find really interesting. It's something I want to learn more about. It's something that I think about now every time I go into the forest, is just like looking at how, this big Douglas fir tree is connecting to this little sapling, and it could be feeding the nutrients. And it's kind of like this all-encompassing. I no longer look at a forest as a group of individual trees or individual plants. I look at it as kind of like the superorganism that I'm walking into. And I think I hope that you do that as well. There's tons of articles about this. There's like in the Smithsonian and the New York Times and Time Magazine. There's lots of really well written articles about kind of the mycelium network and how trees talk. That's definitely worth a further read if you're interested. Now, with that said, we'll go to the next part of this, which is the connected forest. So the forest is connected. But now, how can we connect to the forest? So one of the things that I find most challenging sometimes about returning from work or returning from a Nat Hab expedition, because we're just so lucky to be in such beautiful natural spaces most of the time, and kind of away from most of the constant noise, movement, and chaos that is our society. We are constantly surrounded by distractions. It's like, this is like the age of distraction. It's the age of there's something to do. There's always more to do. Whether that be like TV, news, advertising, cell phones, cars, buses running around, huge crowds that, in cities, all there's noise everywhere. There's stuff happening everywhere, and we're constantly distracted by it. The Environmental Protection Agency suggests that over 90% of our time is spent indoors, and that's likely more than at any point during human history. So, we need to look at that and move past it. There's also this amazing thing, which is kind of technology burnout, and also just in general being addicted to technology. Just like, you know what? I have nothing to do for 5 minutes, so I'm just going to go look at pictures on my phone. And it's basically left us with like this constant need to be entertained. We have an incredibly short, or I have an incredibly short attention span, even as somebody who spends a lot of time in nature. Like when I started to do this presentation, I'm like sitting here and I couldn't spend more like 2 minutes focusing on the computer. And I think that's because I've spent a lot of time just like farting around on my cell phone and that kind of stuff. And I'm just like distractible. And it's something that I don't experience often. But when I do, I'm just like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I get like this little wellness message that's saying I spent X number of hours on my phone. And I've been just like flipping through Instagram stories and stuff, and I just have like no attention span anymore for doing stuff that I can actually like apply myself to. It's not a greater problem for me. It just happened when I was doing this presentation. I thought that was really funny. But so there's technology burnout. So how do we kind of counter that? And I want to tell you just a little bit about forest bathing, or what's known as Shinrin-yoku. Take it as you will. This has been a really popular activity for quite some time. The term Shinrin-yoku emerged in the 1980s in Japan. It's something really important to kind of think about with that is it's not, it's not exercise, it's not hiking, to get to the top of that mountain. It's not jogging. It's not going for a walk with a bunch of people and walking your dogs together and talking. It is very much so your time. It is for you, and it is quite simply it's being in nature, connecting with it through our sense of sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch. And the benefits from doing something like forest bathing, and I'm going to tell you how to. I'm not going to tell you how to do it. I'm going to give you basically some examples of how I forest bathe. Or spend time in nature, and then I'll leave it up to you to go and find kind of the right avenue for doing it yourself if you want to. But the real benefits, there's real health benefits, both physical and mental. Now there's a paper that I looked at online. It's called Effect of Forest Bathing or Shinrin-yoku on Human Health, a review of the literature. So there's been numerous studies on what time spent in nature can do for your body. And some of the top findings of this paper, I'll just read them out, and you're welcome to, I can even send you the link to this paper if you want to go and have a look at it yourself. But one of them is to increase the human natural killer or NK activity, the number of NK cells and the intracellular levels of anti-cancer proteins, suggesting a preventative effect on cancers. Another one is reduce blood pressure, heart rate, and stress hormones such as urinary adrenaline, noradrenaline, and salivary cortisol. And another one in the profile of mood states test, reduce the scores for anxiety, depression, anger, fatigue, and confusion, and increase the score for vigor, showing psychological effects as well. These findings suggest that forest environments may have preventative effects on lifestyle-related diseases. I just find that very interesting. I'm not a doctor. I haven't researched this myself. I haven't studied it myself. I just have kind of my experience being somebody who spends a lot of time in nature, and I'm not even suggesting that you go do it yourself. It's only something that if you want to do it, if you find it interesting yourself, then go and do it. But something I realized personally is that, like, ever since I was a late teen, kind of I was introduced to the outdoors through an outdoor education program when I was a kid, and I found out that kind of, I guess I've been in some ways forest bathing without knowing it for about half my life. I spent a lot of time in the woods, and like I had these little things, like if I ever, was feeling kind of stressed or overwhelmed, like my go-to was go for a hike. Whenever I needed time with my thoughts, if I wanted to really think through a tough problem, I'd go for a hike. And sometimes, like, even if I was feeling a little bit under the weather, like maybe I was just getting over a cold or something like that, and I've been spending so much time indoors kind of nurturing myself, drinking tea and cozied up on the couch kind of thing, sleeping lots, something that I felt would, like, I don't know, in hindsight, who knows, but I basically would go for a walk for an hour or something like that in the woods, and it would kind of like give me that kick to be like, okay, yeah, you're outside now, things are good. I'm sure there's a lot of other things that were going on, but I've always returned from a meander through the forest kind of with a sense of well-being, a better outlook, less stressed, and ready to take on any challenge. And so, yeah, I realized kind of at that point that my connection to nature was much more than just an enjoyment of trees, but a whole body and mind experience for me. So I'll just give you a quick brief how-to, and I highly encourage you to, if this is something you want to do, there's tons and tons of information out there about it. But I find that I wanted to just share with you something really meaningful to me that I find when I go into the forest, and the way that I look at the forest, and the way that I learn from the forest and kind of just exist in nature. So finding the right space is really important. Free from kind of noise, businesses, cameras, phones, trains, highways, all that kind of stuff. Just leave all that stuff behind. You kind of want a place to be just you and the environment. Treed areas, meadows, open spaces, as long as it's a natural environment, are really good. And it doesn't, like, something to keep in mind is, I used to kind of think this way, it's just like, I want to go for a hike, so I have to, like, drive 2 hours to go to this really cool spot and make sure that it's like kind of this extravagant adventure. But it really doesn't have to be that. There's like some really fantastic forests that are right around where I live, where it takes me 10 or 15 minutes to get there. That's where I go. And any park-like space will do, as long as you can kind of find those key elements of nature. Also find, good places to sit down. So if you've been walking for 20 minutes and you're just like, you know what, this is a nice spot, I think I'd like to sit down for a minute. That is always a good idea. So walk for 15 or 20 minutes, sit down, look around, enjoy, and away you go. And then also, if you can find natural sounds, so if there's like a creek or a river or something, or even if it's like a softly raining day, light rain, on the leaves of the trees, or maybe a really popular place, like a popular place where you've got some birds moving around, just kind of like those general sounds of nature, kind of also help it make it the right space. And And then you want to find kind of the right duration and the right time. So I find something that I catch myself doing is like I have a pretty busy schedule, and so I always kind of like rush myself. I'm just like, you know what? Okay, I've got 30 minutes. You know, I'm going to go for this nature walk, and then by the time I get to the car, I forgot some things. I have to run back inside. And then by the time I come back, I've only got like 25 minutes left to go do something. So it's like, you know, make sure that if you're going to do this, you know, set the time aside for yourself. Make it really important, a thing for you. So kind of open up that space and that time in your day to actually go out, and, you know, whether that's a 30-minute walk or a 2-hour walk, it's kind of nice to have the flexibility to just be finished when you kind of feel finished, and not necessarily like chisel it into a schedule so that you have like, I'm doing a 30-minute forest bathing activity right now. It's more like, oh yeah, I've got an hour and a half, so I think I'll go for a walk in the woods and just see where I come back, see what time I come back. Just give yourself enough time to enjoy and be present. And keep in mind too, if you're somebody who, you know, maybe you don't want to walk for an hour straight, you know, that's, you want to be comfortable the whole time. You don't want your feet to be hurting. You don't want your back to be sore. You kind of want to just be meandering at your own pace. And leave behind your devices. Don't bring your camera. Don't bring, you know, if you're going to bring your phone for safety reasons, you know, turn it off, put it in your backpack or whatever. Don't bring these things that you'd normally be playing with. You know, even you could even take off your watch if you wanted to, and just be, you know, things to bring with you might be like water, snacks, proper clothing. You want to make sure you are comfortable, but at the same time, like, leave behind that stuff. Whenever I go for a hike, something I notice is if I have my cell phone in my pocket, I am checking my cell phone. I just checked it. I got a new email. I'm checking my pocket like every 5 minutes on my hike because I can feel it and it's right there. So if I'm going to go for a proper hike, I throw that thing into my backpack and I put it on silent, and it's like, I'm not going to check it until I'm back at the car, or I'm not going to check it until, you know, like I give myself a time frame before I will access it. But it's really important to set those boundaries. And then the next part of that is to just take your time. Notice those details. So it's really important. It's not a big hike. It's not, you know, you're not racing up to the top of this mountain. It's just like a meander. You know, you don't really want to break a sweat. It's just going nice and slow and taking the opportunity to be inquisitive, to look closely, to let yourself be curious. Go, you know, put your hand on that tree, go smell those leaves, you know, that kind of thing. Notice the colors, the smells, and your thoughts. Basically, your effort, your goal is essentially to minimize your effort to achieve anything and to have no expectations for how it's going to go. And then once you're there, once you're in it, engage your senses, listen, smell, watch, touch. It's something I try to do even out on the tundra on a polar rover trip. I'll try to stop the rover at some point, turn the engine off, and just go be there and be like, you are on the tundra. And, you know, it's so important to do that in any scenario, anywhere you go, to actually like place yourself into that location and place yourself into that spot. But by giving yourself the opportunity to really engage within a natural space, you're going to hear more, you're going to smell more, you're going to see more, and in general, I think you're going to just feel more from that adventure. So with that being said, folks, thank you very much. I hope you enjoy your weekend. I hope I was able to kind of impress upon you some interesting pieces of my life and what I find really wonderful about the forest, and maybe make you a little more curious to learn more about the forest around you, and to spend more time in nature. So anyways, thank you very much. If you want to connect with me, I'm on Instagram or Facebook there. But yeah, thank you very much, everyone.
Eddie, thank you so much for that fascinating bit of information, and also the wonderful reminder to just get out there and enjoy nature and be in nature without any distractions. So thank you. Before we start the Q&A, I want to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the questions field in your control panel. But we already have lots to talk about. One thing that people were curious about. I had several related questions about forest fires and the communication between the connected forests. So as a forest fire approaches, is there any information about how the trees communicate or how the system communicates that approaching danger? And then once a forest fire comes into the area, how does it affect communication? That's a tricky one. I don't expect an answer, but there was some curiosity there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I have, it's like, it's one of those things, it's one of those questions where I'm just like, oh, wow, I don't know, but I want to find out. That's pretty cool. I was actually just listening to a podcast the other day about forest fires and forest fire ecology. And I mean, something that's important to keep in mind is there's quite a few ecosystems where, or forest ecosystems where fire is actually a necessary part of their development. Like in the boreal forest, for example, with black spruce, their cones are all the way up at the top of the very top of the tree, and they're covered with a waxy coating. And the waxy coating only melts and releases the seeds after a forest fire. So there's already those adaptations kind of within the forest, just like, yeah, you know, the forest knows it's going to burn. And so it has that adaptation already. As far as the speed at which communication can go in the forest, you know, we're not talking about like the speed of a text message or the speed of that'd be great though, if like, you know, if we can just, you know, if a tree could like just text its neighbor and be like, yeah, so I'm on fire. If you could just maybe not light on fire, that'd be great, because I know there's a whole bunch of other trees that don't want to. But the speed at which the communication goes, I don't think it's kind of lightning speed. It takes some time. So something like a forest fire, which is more of like an urgent and fast moving device, I haven't heard of any mechanisms through which the mycelium network can kind of facilitate that conversation. But it's something I'm going to look up. I'm actually going to write that down right now.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting question, and several folks had some variation of it. So yeah, we should look into that. Couple other technical ones. How far away can the hub tree be from a sapling that it's helping? And then if one of the mother trees dies or is cut down, does another tree simply take its place and provide nutrients to saplings? Do you have any insight into those related questions?
Yeah, I do have some insight in particular on what happens if a hub tree dies. The hub tree basically, like the nutrients that has been stored in that tree then go back into the forest. There's like a really great saying, it's one of my favorite ones on nature hikes when I'm kind of discussing this with people. And that is that basically if a tree takes 100 years to grow, it's going to deliver nutrients back to the forest for the next 100 years. So it takes a long time for trees to decompose. It takes a long time for those nutrients to be taken up by the forest again. But you know, guess what's going to do a lot of the decomposition, and guess what's going to be shifting around a lot of those nutrients? It's going to be kind of microorganisms as well as fungi and the mycorrhizal network, and or kind of the mycorrhizae starting to work and break down and take nutrients from that. So it all kind of ends up back within the system. It just takes a long time. And I would imagine so, like the mother tree or the hub tree, you know, it's not a situation where the forest, you know, votes in, you know, Doug the tree over here is the biggest one. He's been there for so many years. It's basically just the largest tree or a larger tree within a network. And there can be multiple mother trees or hub trees within a certain area. So like if you had 100 meters by 100 meters or 300 feet by 300 feet of forest, and you had, let's say, just, you know, throwing this out there, like 6 larger trees, those larger trees would be considered hub trees. And they're quite simply going to be more interconnected than the other trees because of their age and the size of their root network and whatnot. They might even be connected to each other. And then the smaller trees will benefit from them being there because they do kind of have that sink effect where they are sending, or the nutrients are being sent to the smaller trees, or the trees that are not providing as well or as efficient as those larger trees. So if one of those falls down, it then provides to the habitat. And yes, the other larger trees will just then become the hub tree.
Mm-hmm. So fascinating. So we talked a little bit about, or really just got curious about what happens to that system with fire, forest fire. Do you have any insight into what happens when there's drought? Often they go hand in hand, but one could happen without the other. I mean, how does drought affect the mycorrhizae, the fungal connections?
Well, I would venture and say, so from my reading and my understanding, like one of the big benefits of or like a really great benefit of the mycorrhizal network is its ability to connect trees to water as well. Mm. So it just has the tree roots have so much of a connection. So if you have a forest that is established and well connected with a really strong kind of interconnected mycorrhizal network, it is going to have, I mean, like I haven't read any studies on this, but just from my reading and what I've seen, I would venture and say that forest will be more resistant to drought. Of course, mm-hmm. There's a point in any system where if there's just no water coming in, then the trees die, and the trees die, the mycorrhizal network loses its source of, like the fungi will then lose its source of nutrients, like its source of carbohydrates. And so then following that, the mycorrhizal network will die. So same kind of thing may happen in the sense that with some forest fired areas, I'm sure, but even then, forest areas that have forest fires tend to be extremely good for certain types of mushrooms. So it might just be like a succession. There could be different network that takes over, which is all part of, I mean, depending on where you're from, like in the boreal forest or in areas of BC, we've had some horrendous wildfires over the years, but there's some parts of that which is, there's kind of like this natural succession within the forest, allowing for different species to come in. So it's kind of good. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I would say like the drought, it would provide the trees with more access. And then the last thing I want to talk about there was like with logging, where it's kind of like this unnatural removal of trees. It doesn't take very long before the existing mycorrhizal network, once it loses those carbohydrate resources, which is the trees photosynthesizing and sending those nutrients down into the mycorrhizal network. Mm-hmm. It doesn't take long before the mycorrhizal network does disappear, and it just won't function anymore.
And so once it disappears, how is there any way to reintroduce fungus to the system? Like in someone's garden, would it be an enhancing or a way to enhance the health of the garden to intentionally introduce fungus? Are you familiar with any gardening techniques or ways to intentionally insert those
yeah.
things into the system? And is that helpful, or are you aware of any insight into that?
So it's really interesting, because like one of the secondary topics that came up when I was doing this research was actually like to do with horticulture and gardening essentially, and like farming and whatnot. So I would say there is. Do I know about it? Do I know the details, or like where to get the good mycorrhizae to make your tomatoes grow bigger? I don't have the answer to that, but I think it's out there. And if you just looked up mycorrhizae fungi gardening, I think you'd be pretty overwhelmed with information.
Wow, this is so fascinating, and I know it's a relatively new science out there, or new observations. There's so much more to learn, but from the questions that are coming up, there's clearly a lot of interest and a lot of people making the same connections. So it'll be fascinating to watch this knowledge base evolve, and I so appreciate you bringing it to our attention. I think that's all we have time for today, so I'll just turn it back to you for any closing comments.
Absolutely. I think like when I was writing this presentation or creating this presentation, I was just like, oh, there's like too much interesting stuff to fit into an hour, which is often a problem that I have. But I might have to do a sequel on kind of forest connections part 2.
There's definitely an interest for that.
That's good. That's good. But yeah, I sure hope that everyone you've kind of tuned in and learned something new and maybe left with a new curiosity. Something I find really important about what I do is sometimes I don't want to just tell you everything you need to know. Sometimes I want to tell you enough information so that you're curious and you want to learn more, and like you kind of get excited for the world around you in a different way. So yeah, we'll see. I've got a few more webinars coming up in the new year, so maybe I'll throw in a Forest Connections part 2. But thank you very much for tuning in.
And just some folks have shared some resources that might be interesting to the larger group. One is on Netflix documentary called Fabulous Fungi. If you haven't seen that, you might want to check it out. And another reference is to a book called The Secret Life of Trees. I'm sure there's tons more, but those sound like 2 good places to start if you want to continue in this direction of exploration. So thanks so much for everyone who tuned in. Please join us on Monday for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation and will have a replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. I hope everyone gets out there and does some forest bathing sometime this weekend. Make it a priority. Take good care, everyone. Bye-bye.